They called us old legends, until Terran soldiers walked into the fire. The alarm shrieked through Fortress Omega at 0400 hours. Deho was awake before the second pulse, his body responding to years of training. Around him, his soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, gearing up in under 3 minutes. Breck's assault force. 3,000 strong hitting the auxiliary depot, Yejin reported. Reading the tactical feed, coalition forces are deploying to defensive positions. The auxiliary depot was 5 kilometers from the main fortress, a sprawling complex where ammunition and supplies were stored. Losing it would cripple the coalition's ability to sustain operations in this sector. Daiho's unit arrived at the command center to find controlled chaos. General Veklar was coordinating the defense, his forearms moving across multiple holographic displays simultaneously. Status? Daiho asked. A coalition officer glanced at him with barely concealed irritation. The Vrex broke through our early warning perimeter using stealth ships. They're deploying shock troops directly onto the depot. Our forces are engaging now. On the main display, Daiho could see the battle unfolding. Coalition soldiers had established firing positions at optimal range, their energy weapons creating brilliant flashes of light as they engaged the Vrex. The enemy troops were advancing steadily, their own weapons returning fire. Casualties? Hyejin asked. 11% and rising, the officer replied. We're maintaining suppressive fire, but the Vrex are using their standard overwhelming force tactics. Daiho watched the display carefully. The coalition forces were good, disciplined, their fire accurate and coordinated. But they were static, holding positions at maximum engagement range. The Vrex were accepting the casualties and pushing forward, knowing that once they reached close range, the coalition troops would retreat according to their doctrine. Sir, recommend we deploy to support the defense, Daiho said to Veklar. Negative, Veklar replied without looking up. You'll remain here in reserve. This situation is under control. General, with respect, your forces will reach retreat threshold in approximately 12 minutes. Yejin said, analyzing the casualty projections. The Vrex will take the depot. Then we evacuate the depot and deny them the supplies, Veklar said. We're already preparing demolition charges. Better to destroy the materials than let them fall into enemy hands. Daiho felt his jaw tighten. You're going to give up that facility without even attempting to hold it? We don't throw away lives in pointless last stands, Captain, Veklar said sharply. That depot can be rebuilt. Trained soldiers cannot be easily replaced. On the display, the coalition casualty counter ticked upward. 12%, 13%. The Vrex were now within 1 kilometer of the depot's main buildings. Evacuation order in 2 minutes, an officer announced. Daiho made his decision. Lieutenant Hyejin, get our people moving. Full combat load. We're deploying to the depot. Sir, General Veklar ordered us to remain in reserve, Hyejin pointed out, though she was already signaling the unit to move. I heard what he ordered, Daiho replied. I'm choosing to misunderstand those orders. Let's go. The humans were moving before Veklar could respond, sprinting through the fortress corridors toward the transport bay. Behind them, they could hear the general's angry clicks and whistles, but Daiho didn't slow down. 6 transport shuttles carried the 500 humans toward the depot. Commander Bora, monitoring from orbit in one of the human vessels, opened a channel. Captain, I'm tracking Vrex reinforcements. You'll have limited time before they bring in heavy weapons. Understood, Daiho replied. We just need to hold long enough for the coalition to realize the position isn't lost. The shuttles came in fast and hard, their pilots executing combat landings that would have terrified coalition crews. The humans poured out, immediately forming defensive positions around the depot's perimeter. Minho's engineering team went to work immediately, setting up improvised barriers using whatever materials they could find. The coalition forces, retreating according to their casualty thresholds, stared in confusion as the humans moved forward to occupy the positions they were abandoning. What are they doing? A coalition soldier asked his commander. I have no idea, the officer replied. They're moving toward the enemy. The Vrex, seeing fresh troops, concentrated their fire on the human positions. Jiwan, crouched behind a barricade, felt her first real combat fear as plasma bolts scorched the air around her. The heat was intense, the noise overwhelming, and the smell of burning metal filled her nose. Steady, Corporal Junho said from beside her. The sniper was methodically engaging Vrex commanders, his old-fashioned rifle making sharp cracks that seemed primitive compared to the energy weapons. But each shot found its target. and the Vrex advance began to falter as their leadership was systematically eliminated. Dr. Tae-young had set up a field medical station inside one of the depot buildings. Coalition soldiers who had been wounded in the initial assault watched in amazement as the human medic worked under fire, seemingly unconcerned by the plasma bolts impacting nearby. "You should evacuate," a wounded Coalition soldier told him. "This position will fall, will it?" Tae-young replied, not looking up from the wound he was treating. "We'll see." For 6 hours the battle raged. The Vrex threw wave after wave at the human positions, expecting the defenders to break and retreat like Coalition forces always did. But the humans didn't retreat. When positions became untenable, they fell back to secondary lines and held there. When ammunition ran low, they used captured Vrex weapons. Minho had rigged explosive traps using abandoned Coalition equipment, turning the depot's approach routes into kill zones. Every time the Vrex massed for a push, carefully placed charges would detonate, breaking their formations. Daeho moved along the defensive line, encouraging his soldiers, coordinating fire, making split-second tactical decisions. A plasma bolt caught him in the shoulder, burning through his armor. He ignored it, continuing to direct the defense. "Sir, you need medical attention," Yejin insisted. "Later," Daeho said through gritted teeth. "How are our casualties?" 43%, Yejin replied. "We're below half strength." "We hold," Daeho said simply. In Fortress Omega's command center, General Veklar watched the battle with growing disbelief. The humans should have broken hours ago. By any logical calculation, they should have evacuated or been overrun, but they were still there, still fighting, still holding the line. "Their casualty rate is catastrophic," an officer said. "Why don't they retreat?" "Because they're insane," the Kelvin officer muttered. But he was watching the display with something that might have been respect. Admiral Kuvan studied the tactical data. "General, the Vrex assault has stalled. The humans have broken their momentum. If we reinforce now, we can turn this into a victory." Veklar hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Send in the reserves. All of them." Coalition forces poured back into the fight, energized by the realization that the position could be held. With fresh troops and the Vrex advance already disrupted by the human defense, the battle turned. The enemy began to withdraw, unable to maintain their assault in the face of renewed resistance. When the fighting finally ended, Coalition soldiers moved through the depot in stunned silence. The evidence of the desperate defense was everywhere. Human blood mixed with Vrex ichor on the ground. Blast marks covered every surface. Bodies lay where they had fallen. 215 humans had died in the defense. Another 100 were wounded. Of the original 500, less than 200 were still combat effective. But the depot stood. The supplies were secure, and the Vrex assault had been repelled. General Veklar found Captain Daeho being treated by Dr. Tae-young. His shoulder burned, but the wound already dressed. The human captain stood at attention despite his injury. "You disobeyed a direct order," Veklar said. "Yes, sir," Daeho replied, offering no excuse or justification. Veklar studied him for a long moment. "You lost nearly half your force defending a supply depot." "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you retreat when casualties exceeded acceptable levels?" Daeho met the general's eyes. "Because acceptable losses is a calculation made by people who aren't doing the fighting. We stay until the mission is complete or we can't fight anymore. Those are the only two acceptable outcomes." Around them, Coalition soldiers who had fought alongside the humans nodded slowly. They had seen something today that didn't fit their understanding of warfare. They had seen soldiers fight past the point where logic said they should break, endure past the threshold where doctrine said they should withdraw, and win by refusing to accept defeat. "I need to report your insubordination," Veklar said. "Yes, sir," Daeho agreed. "But first," Veklar continued, "I need to assign you to combat operations. It seems we have much to learn from you humans." His mandibles clicked in what might have been respect. "Perhaps the old legends weren't just stories after all." They called us old legends, until Terran soldiers walked into the fire. The command center was packed with Coalition officers, all waiting to hear Lieutenant Hyejin's briefing. Word of the depot defense had spread through the fortress, and what had been contempt had transformed into confused fascination. General Veklar had ordered a full analysis of human military doctrine, and Hyejin had been chosen to present it. She stood before the assembly with her datapad, projecting historical records and tactical analyses into the holographic display. Her shoulder was bandaged from a minor wound, but she had refused extended medical leave. Human military doctrine is fundamentally different from coalition standards, she began. Where you optimize for casualty reduction and force preservation, we optimize for mission completion regardless of cost. A Kelvin officer raised one hand. Lieutenant, no one disputes your courage at the depot. But courage alone doesn't win wars. Your casualty rate was unsustainable. If you fight every battle that way, you'll run out of soldiers. You're already running out of territory, Hyejin countered. In 50 years of fighting the Virex, the Coalition has lost 47 colony worlds and hundreds of outposts. You preserve your forces by retreating, but every retreat gives the enemy more ground, more resources, more momentum. She changed the display to show Earth's military history. Humans evolved on a world with no dominant species. We competed with each other for thousands of years. Our history is an endless series of conflicts, each one teaching us new ways to fight, new ways to endure. Images flashed across the display. Ancient battles where armies clashed with primitive weapons. Medieval sieges that lasted years. Industrial age wars where millions died in single campaigns. Modern conflicts fought in cities, jungles, mountains, and deserts. We learned something other species never had to learn, Hyejin continued. We learned that survival sometimes requires walking into certain death. That there are objectives worth any cost. That retreat isn't always an option. Captain Yuna, the psychological operations officer, stepped forward to join the briefing. At 33, she had degrees in xenopsychology and comparative military theory. Coalition species evolved on worlds where they were apex predators or achieved dominance early in their development. You've never had to fight total wars against equally matched opponents. Your conflicts are limited, rational, with clear victory conditions and acceptable loss ratios. And humans? Admiral Kuvan asked quietly. Humans had to fight total wars just to survive our own prehistory, Yuna replied. We developed psychological adaptations that other species lack. We can function effectively even when we know the odds are against us. We can maintain cohesion and morale at casualty rates that would shatter other species. She brought up neurological scans comparing human and coalition brain chemistry. When faced with life-threatening danger, most species experience what we call rational fear. Their survival instincts demand withdrawal to preserve the individual. Human brains are different. We can override those survival instincts through what we call discipline, honor, or duty. We can choose to stay and fight even when every biological impulse tells us to run. A coalition medical officer studied the scans with growing horror. That's a pathological response. You've essentially bred a species-wide death wish. No, Deho said, speaking for the first time. He had been standing at the back of the room, his wounded shoulder in a sling. We have a species-wide will to win. There's a difference. He moved to the front of the room and the officers parted to let him pass. You fight to minimize losses. We fight to achieve victory. You calculate acceptable casualties before the battle starts. We decide what's acceptable after the objective is secured. You see death as a failure. We see surrender as a failure, but why? Veklar demanded. Why throw away lives unnecessarily? Because sometimes lives aren't being thrown away, Deho replied. Sometimes they're being spent on something that matters more than individual survival. Ambassador Somin entered the room and the discussion fell silent. She moved to stand beside Deho, her expression grave. You asked why Earth withdrew from the Coalition, she said. You asked why we harbor resentment for something that happened centuries ago. Let me tell you exactly what happened at Sigma Draconis. The display changed to show battle records from 400 years past. 3 human colonies were under assault by an unknown hostile force. We called for coalition support. You sent 12 fleets, including ships from every major species. The battle seemed winnable, but casualties began to mount. After 6 hours of fighting, coalition losses reached 14%. Within acceptable parameters, an officer noted. You retreated, Somin said, her voice hard. All of you. 12 fleets, overwhelming firepower, and you withdrew because the math said you should. You left 40 million humans to die because saving them would have cost too many of your lives. The silence in the room was absolute. We sent distress signals, Somin continued. We begged you to come back. We offered anything, everything if you would just help us. And you refused. Your commanders said it would be illogical to risk more losses for a position that was already compromised. Those colonies died, Deho added quietly. Every human on those worlds. 40 million people who trusted the coalition to stand with them. We learned that day that we could only trust ourselves. Because when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, you did what was logical. You calculated the cost and decided we weren't worth it. Private Dongwu, standing near the door, spoke up. The young heavy weapons specialist was irreverent by nature, but his voice was serious now. That's why we fight the way we do. Because we know that if we retreat, if we give up, nobody else will come to finish the fight. We're all we have, so we hold the line or we die trying. Captain Yuna pulled up more data. After Sigma Draconis, Earth went into isolation. But we didn't hide. We prepared. We studied every human conflict in our history and distilled the lessons into doctrine. We trained every generation in the art of endurance warfare. We made sure that if we ever had to fight again, we would never break. You're describing a traumatized species, the coalition medical officer said, preparing for war for 4 centuries because of one betrayal. Yes, Selman agreed. We are traumatized, collectively as a species, but that trauma taught us strength. It taught us that we can't depend on anyone else. And it taught us that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to lose. General Veklar was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I read the reports from Sigma Draconis. I was an academy student when it happened. My instructors used it as a case study in proper casualty management. He paused. They never mentioned the 40 million humans. Just the coalition losses and the decision matrix that justified retreat. Of course they didn't, Deho said. Because acknowledging those deaths would mean acknowledging that your doctrine failed. That sometimes the logical choice isn't the right choice. Admiral Kuvan stood. Captain Deho, what you're describing is a fundamental difference in how we view warfare. We see it as a problem to be solved with minimal cost. You see it as a test of will. Yes, Deho agreed. Then teach us, Kuvan said. Show us how to fight your way. Because watching you at that depot, seeing soldiers hold against impossible odds, I realized something. The Vreks don't fear us. They accept their casualties and push forward, because they know we'll eventually retreat. But they might fear you. They might break against an enemy that refuses to break first. Veklar considered this, then nodded slowly. Agreed. Captain Deho, I'm assigning you command of a mixed unit. 200 humans and 800 coalition volunteers. You'll train them in your methods. And if this works, we'll expand the program. One condition, Deho said. If I'm training them to fight like humans, they need to understand what that means. No retreats without my authorization. No withdrawal at predetermined casualty thresholds. We hold until the objective is achieved, or I give the order to fall back. Can your soldiers accept that? The room erupted in debate. Officers argued about doctrine, about the chain of command, about the psychological impact of such orders. But Private Jiwan, watching from her position near Deho, saw something interesting. Several coalition soldiers, ones who had fought at the depot, were nodding. They had seen what human doctrine could achieve. They had watched soldiers fight past the point of reason and win. I volunteer, said a coalition soldier, surprising everyone. More voices joined his, soldiers stepping forward to join the mixed unit. Veklar raised his hands for silence. Very well. Captain Deho, you have your unit. Train them well, because coalition intelligence has located something important. He brought up a new display showing a heavily fortified moon, the Vrek Central War Nexus. If we can take it, we can end this war, but it will require the kind of assault that no coalition force has ever attempted. Deho studied the fortress, seeing the layered defenses, the impossible odds. Then he smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. It was the smile of someone who had walked into fire before and was preparing to do it again. When do we deploy? He asked. 6 weeks, Veklar replied. You have 6 weeks to train your unit and prepare for an assault that every tactical computer says is suicide. Good, Deho said. That's just enough time to teach them what humans have always known. That sometimes suicide missions are the only kind worth at. They called us old legends. Until Terran soldiers walked into the fire. The training facility was a converted cargo bay, stripped bare and transformed into a simulation of hell. Private Dongwu had helped design the course, and he took perverse pride in watching coalition soldiers struggle through it. Move, 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 Sergeant Minho shouted as a squad of mixed human and coalition troops crawled through smoke-filled corridors. Explosive charges detonated around them, close enough to feel the heat. The enemy doesn't care about your comfort. Keep moving, A Kelvin soldier froze as a charge went off near his head. His training told him to seek cover, wait for the bombardment to stop, minimize exposure. But Corporal Junho was beside him immediately. "Through the fire," Junho said quietly. "Not around it. Through it." The Kelvin soldier looked at the quiet sniper, then nodded and kept moving. For 6 weeks, Deho's mixed unit trained in tactics that seemed suicidal to coalition doctrine. They practiced fighting at close range where coalition troops normally retreated. They learned to advance under fire instead of seeking optimal defensive positions. They ran drills where casualty rates exceeded 50%, and they were expected to continue the mission. Lieutenant Kyungmi, the intelligence officer, spent her time studying Vrex psychology and communication patterns. At 29, she had dedicated her career to understanding enemy thinking. Now she briefed the assault force on what they would face. The Vrex expect enemies to be rational, she explained. They calculate force ratios, project casualties, and predict retreats. Their entire tactical doctrine is built on the assumption that opponents will withdraw at predictable thresholds. This fortress moon is designed to inflict maximum casualties early, triggering coalition retreat protocols. She displayed the fortress's layout. 3 layers of automated defenses surrounded it. 50,000 Vrex warriors defended the interior. Energy barriers protected critical systems. By any calculation, assaulting it directly was impossible. "So we do the impossible," Deho said simply. "We drop directly onto the fortress, bypass the outer defenses, and fight our way to the core. No retreat, no extraction plan until the objective is secured." Captain Yuna had been working on psychological preparation. She knew that coalition soldiers, despite their training, would struggle with the human approach to warfare. So she focused on reframing their understanding. "You've been taught that survival is the primary goal," she told a group of volunteers, "that preserving your life is the rational choice. But survival isn't the same as victory. Sometimes you have to risk everything to win. How do you make that choice?" a coalition soldier asked. "How do you decide to walk into certain death?" "You don't think of it as certain death," Private Jiwon replied. She had become something of a symbol for the coalition troops. The young human who had held a choke point alone while wounded. You think of it as certain victory if you're willing to pay the price. The assault force was assembled. 2,000 humans from additional units Earth had sent, and 5,000 coalition volunteers who had trained in human doctrine. 7,000 soldiers preparing to assault a fortress designed to repel 10 times that number. Commander Bora's fleet would provide orbital support, but Vrex reinforcements would arrive within 4 hours. The assault force would have to take the fortress in that window or face overwhelming odds. The night before deployment, Deho walked through the barracks. His soldiers were checking equipment, writing final messages home, or simply sitting in quiet contemplation. He saw humans and aliens side by side, bound together by training and purpose. Sergeant Wonshik, the demolitions expert at 38, was explaining his plan to breach the fortress's power core to a group of coalition engineers. "The charges have to be placed precisely. If we're off by even a meter, the explosion will be contained by the secondary shielding. And if we place them correctly?" an engineer asked. "Then the whole sector loses power and we can push through to the command center," Wonshik said. He didn't mention that placing the charges would require working in an area that would be under heavy fire. The engineers already knew that. Dr. Taeyong was preparing his medical station. He would establish a field hospital once they secured a section of the fortress. The odds of him surviving to use it were low, but he prepared anyway with meticulous care. Ambassador Soman found Deho on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. "Captain, ready for tomorrow?" "As ready as we can be," Deho replied. "The projections aren't good." "When have they ever been good for humans?" Soman asked with a slight smile. "We don't win because the odds favor us. We win because we refuse to lose. 60 to 70% casualties expected," Deho said quietly. "Maybe more. I'm leading most of these soldiers to their deaths." "You're leading them to victory," Somin corrected. "Yes, many will die, but the ones who survive will end this war. They'll save billions of lives across the coalition. That's worth the cost, is it?" Deho asked. "Sometimes I wonder if we're just repeating the same mistake over and over. Throwing lives away because we're too stubborn to admit defeat. The difference," Sumin said softly, "is that we're not defeated until we accept defeat. Those soldiers out there, human and alien alike, They've chosen to stand with us. They understand what we're doing and why. That's not throwing lives away. That's spending them on something that matters. The next morning, the assault force assembled in the launch bays. 7,000 soldiers in drop pods preparing for orbital insertion directly onto the fortress moon. General Veklar addressed them through the communication system. "I've reviewed every analysis of this mission," he said. "Every tactical computer says it's impossible. Every projection shows unacceptable casualties. By coalition doctrine, this assault should never be attempted." He paused. "But I've learned something from the humans. Sometimes impossible just means nobody has been willing to pay the cost. Today you're paying that cost. For every world the Vrex have taken, for every life they've destroyed, for the future of the coalition. Make it count." Deho stood in his drop pod, surrounded by his command squad. Hyejin, Minho, Junho, Jiwon, and others who had been with him from the start. They had fought together, bled together, and now they would finish this together. "Remember the depot," he said to them. "Remember that we held when everyone said we couldn't. That's what we do. We hold the line." The pods launched. The descent was a nightmare of fire and fury. Automated defenses tracked the pods, filling space with plasma and projectiles. Explosions blossomed across the formation as pods were destroyed. Deho's pod spun wildly as fragments of debris struck it, the internal system screaming warnings, then impact. The pod crashed through the fortress's outer hull, tearing through layers of armor plating before slamming into an interior corridor. The hatch blew open and Deho stumbled out into chaos. All around him, pods were crashing through ceilings, walls, and floors. Soldiers poured out, immediately engaging Vrex defenders. The fortress's interior had become a three-dimensional battlefield with no clear front lines. "Command squad, on me," Deho shouted. His soldiers rallied to him, forming up despite the confusion. "One-shik, we need a path to the power core." The demolitions expert checked his tactical display, seeing friendly positions scattered throughout the fortress. 2 kilometers that direction. "Through heavy resistance, then we go through," Deho said. "Fast and hard. No stopping." They moved, and the real battle began. Vrex warriors poured from every corridor, their plasma weapons cutting down soldiers. The humans returned fire with their projectile weapons, their bullets punching through Vrex armor at close range. Coalition soldiers, trained in human doctrine, pushed forward instead of seeking cover. Lieutenant Kyungmi had hacked into the Vrex communication network, flooding it with false reports of massive human forces. The confusion bought precious minutes as Vrex commanders tried to understand how so many enemies had penetrated their fortress. Jiwon found herself in a corridor packed with enemy soldiers. Her rifle empty, she drew her combat knife and charged. The Vrex, expecting rational behavior, were unprepared for the sheer aggression. She cut through them, taking wounds but not stopping, clearing the path for her squad. Dr. Taeyong had established his field hospital in a captured section, working on both human and coalition wounded. Vrex prisoners watched in confusion as he treated injured enemy soldiers alongside his own forces. "Why do you help them?" a Vrex warrior asked. "They're your enemies." "Right now they're just wounded," Taeyong replied, not looking up from his work. "I'll worry about enemies when they're healthy enough to fight again." Sergeant Wanshik reached the power core with his engineering team. The area was heavily defended and plasma fire cut down half his team in the first minute. But the survivors kept moving, placing charges with practiced efficiency even as they died. "Charges set," Wanshik reported. He was wounded, bleeding from multiple hits, but his hands were steady, detonating in 30 seconds. "Clear the area." "Get out of there, Wanshik," Deho ordered. "No time, sir," Wanshik replied. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. "Someone needs to stay and make sure the charges go off correctly. Tell everyone it was an honor." The charges detonated with a roar that shook the entire fortress. Lights flickered and died acre. They called us old legends, until Terran soldiers walked into the fire captain. Deho stood at attention in the briefing room of Fortress Omega, his 500 soldiers arranged in perfect formation behind him. Across from them, General Veklar examined the humans with undisguised skepticism. Coalition officers lined the walls, whispering among themselves. "This is your entire force?" Veklar asked, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into flat, emotionless words. 500 soldiers with primitive equipment?" "Yes, General," Deho replied. His face was weathered, marked by scars that spoke of combat experience. At 43 years old, he had spent half his life preparing for this moment. 500 ready and able. A ripple of amusement passed through the coalition officers. One of them, a tall Kelvin with blue-tinted skin, stepped forward. "Captain, I mean no disrespect, but our standard infantry units number 10,000 soldiers. Your entire force could fit inside one of our transport shuttles. Size isn't everything," Lieutenant Hyejin said from her position beside Deho. She was young, only 28, but her eyes were sharp and analytical. "Effectiveness matters more than numbers, does it?" The Kelvin officer gestured at the humans. "Your armor appears to be simple composite materials. No energy shielding. Your weapons fire solid projectiles that can be stopped by basic body armor, and you carry bladed weapons like ancient warriors." He picked up a combat knife from the equipment display. "What possible use is this against modern military technology?" Sergeant Minho, standing in the front rank, spoke without being asked. "For when the enemy gets close enough that modern technology doesn't matter anymore, sir." Veklar's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. "The Vreks never get that close. We engage them at optimal range and maintain distance. That's basic tactical doctrine." "Which is why you're losing," Hyejin said quietly. The room fell silent. Several officers stiffened at the perceived insult. Veklar's forearms crossed slowly. "Explain yourself, Lieutenant." Hyejin stepped forward and activated her data pad. Holographic displays filled the air, showing battle reports and tactical analyses. "We've studied every major engagement between coalition forces and the Vreks over the past 50 years. You maintain a defensive posture, engage at maximum range, and retreat when casualties reach 10 to 15%. The Vreks have adapted to this pattern. They accept heavier initial losses, close the distance, and force you to withdraw. Then they take the territory you abandoned." "We preserve our forces," an officer protested. "It's illogical to sacrifice soldiers unnecessarily." "Is it?" Deho asked. "How much territory have you lost by preserving your forces? How many colonies have fallen while you retreated to fight another day?" Veklar studied the human captain carefully. "You suggest we should accept higher casualties, throw lives away in futile last stands. I suggest you should hold the line," Deho said. "There's a difference between a futile last stand and fighting for every centimeter of ground. We don't retreat because the math says we should. We retreat when the objective is lost or the mission is complete, not before." "That's suicidal," the Kelvin officer said. "That's war," Minho replied. Admiral Kuven, who had been observing silently, spoke up. "Captain Deho, I've reviewed the historical records of human conflicts. Your species has an unusually high tolerance for casualties. During your World War II, some battles had casualty rates exceeding 70%. Yet your soldiers continued fighting. Why? Deho was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Because we understand something that other species seem to have forgotten. Sometimes the only way forward is through, not around, not in retreat, but straight through the fire. Philosophy won't stop Vrek's plasma weapons, Veklar said dismissively. I've agreed to give you a chance to prove yourselves, but I won't risk coalition lives on your unorthodox methods. You'll be assigned to observation duty on the perimeter. Watch how real soldiers fight. Learn what you can. Private Jiwan, standing in the second rank, felt her jaw tighten. She was only 22, the youngest in the unit, and this was her first deployment off Earth. She had trained for years, pushed herself to the limit, and now they were being dismissed as museum curiosities. Dr. Taeyong, the unit's senior medic, noticed her reaction and gave a slight shake of his head. At 39, he had seen this before. The disrespect, the contempt, the assumption that humans were relics of a less advanced age. He had learned patience. The briefing ended with assignments. The humans were given quarters in the oldest section of the fortress, rooms that hadn't been used in decades. As they filed out, coalition soldiers watched them pass with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. Did you see their weapons? One alien soldier said to his companion, not bothering to lower his voice. Projectile firearms and knives. My ancestors used more advanced technology than that. I heard humans are physically weak too, another added. Slower reflexes, poor night vision, fragile bones. How did they ever survive long enough to develop space travel? Probably by hiding and running away, the first soldier laughed. Jiwan's hands clenched into fists, but Corporal Junho placed a hand on her shoulder. The quiet sniper was 31 and had learned long ago that words meant nothing. Results were all that mattered. That evening, coalition soldiers filled the fortress's recreation areas and bets were being placed. How long would the humans last in their first engagement? Would they break after the first casualty, Or would they at least make it through an entire battle before requesting evacuation? 10 credits says they don't even deploy, a Kelvin soldier said. They'll find some excuse to stay in the rear. 20 credits says they panic at the first sight of Vrex shock troops, another countered. In their quarters, the human soldiers maintained their equipment in silence. Deho watched his troops work, seeing the frustration in their movements, the anger in their eyes. Listen up, he said quietly. The room fell silent. I know what you're feeling. I know what they think of us. And I know you want to prove them wrong. Sir, they treat us like we're nothing, Jawan said. Like we're primitives playing at being soldiers. Good, Deho replied. The response surprised them. Let them underestimate us. Let them think we're soft and weak and outdated, because when the time comes, when the fire starts and the chaos begins, they'll see what we really are. And what's that, sir? Minho asked. Deho smiled, but there was no humor in it. Survivors. Humans don't survive because we're the strongest or the fastest. We survive because we refuse to quit. Because we'll walk through hell itself if that's what it takes to complete the mission. He looked at each of them. They called us legends. Old stories that don't matter anymore. Soon they'll remember why those stories scared them in the first place. Hijin pulled up intelligence reports on her datapad. The Vrex have increased activity in this sector. Coalition analysts predict a probe attack within the next 48 hours. Then we wait, Deho said. And we watch. And when the opportunity comes, we show them what forgotten warriors can do. Outside, in the command center, General Veklar reviewed the human personnel files again. 500 soldiers, inferior technology, outdated tactics. By every logical measure, they should be useless in modern warfare. But something about Ambassador Summon's words nagged at him. That certainty in her voice when she said humans could win or die trying, as if the two outcomes were equally acceptable. What kind of species thought like that? He would find out soon enough. The sensors had detected Vrex ships at the edge of the system. The enemy was coming, and the humans would get their chance to prove themselves, or be revealed as nothing more than ancient myths that couldn't survive in the real world. They called us old legends, until Terran soldiers walked into the fire. The war room fell silent as the casualty report scrolled across the holographic display. 12,000 ships lost, 47 colonies burning. The Vrex Dominion had struck at the heart of the Galactic Coalition, and for the first time in 3 centuries of conflict, the Alliance was losing. General Veklar stood at the command table, his forearms crossed in frustration. Around him, officers from a dozen different species watched the tactical displays with growing despair. The Vrex had broken through the Crimson Nebula defense line, and nothing stood between them and the Coalition's core worlds. We need reinforcements, said Admiral Kuvan, her crystalline skin flickering with stress patterns. Every fleet we have is committed. There are no reserves left. Then we pull back, another officer suggested. Regroup at the inner systems and establish a new defensive perimeter. Veklar slammed one fist on the table. Pull back? We've been pulling back for 50 years. At this rate, we'll be defending our homeworlds within a decade. Then what do you suggest? Kuvan asked quietly. We've exhausted every strategic option. We need forces we don't have and weapons we haven't invented. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Then a voice spoke from the doorway. Perhaps you need allies you've forgotten. Everyone turned. A woman in a simple gray uniform stood at the entrance, her credentials glowing on the security panel. She was human, though most in the room had never seen one in person. Her dark hair was pulled back and her eyes held a weariness that spoke of long experience. Ambassador Somin, Veklar said slowly, Earth hasn't participated in coalition affairs for 400 years. Why would you come now? Somin walked into the room and the officers parted to let her pass. Because you sent a distress signal to every registered coalition member. That includes us, even if you've forgotten we exist. The humans, Kuvan said softly. I've read about your species in the historical archives. You were there at the founding of the coalition, weren't you? We were, Somin replied. Until you left us to die. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Veklar's mandibles clicked in irritation. That was centuries ago. Ancient history. 40 million of my people died when your fleets retreated from Sigma Draconis, Somin said, her voice level but hard. You abandoned 3 human colonies because your casualty projections exceeded acceptable losses. We call it the betrayal. You call it ancient history. And you hold a grudge for 4 centuries? Veklar demanded. No, Soman said quietly. We learned a lesson. We learned that we could only depend on ourselves. She gestured at the tactical display showing the Vrex advance. But it seems you're out of options. So Earth has decided to offer assistance. Admiral Kuvan leaned forward. What kind of assistance? Ships, weapons? Advanced technology? Soldiers, Soman said simply. The room erupted in noise. Officers spoke over each other in a dozen languages, their translation devices creating a chaotic babble. Veklar raised a hand for silence. Soldiers? He repeated. We don't need ground troops. We need naval power. The Vrex control space. What good are infantry? The Vrex hold 17 fortress worlds, Soman said. Your fleets can't break their orbital defenses, and you won't commit to ground assaults because the casualties would be too high. You fight at range, minimize losses, and slowly lose ground. We fight differently. How many ships can you send? Kuvan asked. 6 transport vessels, 500 soldiers. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was broken by laughter. A young officer from the Kelvin species couldn't contain himself. 500? You're offering 500 soldiers to turn the tide of a galactic war? Even Soman's expression tightened, but she didn't respond to the mockery. Veklar studied her carefully. What makes you think 500 humans can make any difference? Because we've been preparing for this war since the day you betrayed us, Soman said. We've spent 4 centuries isolated, yes. But we didn't spend that time in peace. We spent it getting ready for the day when we'd have to stand alone against anything the galaxy could throw at us. Impressive words, Veklar said. But I've seen your historical records. Humans are physically inferior to most coalition species. Weaker, slower, less durable. What can you do that we cannot? We can win, Soman said simply. Or die trying. Whichever comes first. The statement was so matter-of-fact that it took a moment for its implications to sink in. Kuvan's skin flickered in confusion. You speak of dying as if it's an acceptable outcome. Death is always an acceptable outcome if the alternative is defeat, Soman replied. That's the difference between us. Veklar considered this. The coalition was desperate, that much was true. And 500 soldiers wouldn't deplete their resources if the humans proved useless. Very well. Send your troops to Fortress Omega. We'll evaluate their capabilities. They're already en route, Soman said. Captain Deho's unit will arrive in 72 hours. As she left the war room, the officers broke into heated discussion. The Kelvin officer who had laughed earlier turned to his companion. 500 primitives with projectile weapons. This should be entertaining. I've heard stories about humans, Kuvan said quietly. Old stories from the founding era. They say humans were different from other species, that they fought in ways we couldn't understand. Myths and legends, Veklar dismissed. Useful for inspiring academy students, but this is a real war. We need real solutions, not ancient folklore. He turned back to the tactical display. Still, we have nothing to lose. Let's see if these forgotten warriors are anything more than stories. 3 days later, 6 small human vessels emerged from faster-than-light travel near Fortress Omega. The ships were angular and utilitarian, lacking the sleek designs of modern coalition warships. They had no visible shield emitters, no energy weapon arrays. They looked like cargo haulers, not military transports. In the command center of Fortress Omega, officers gathered to watch the humans disembark. Captain Deho was the first to exit, followed by his soldiers. They wore simple combat armor, carried weapons that fired solid projectiles and moved with efficient precision. An officer monitoring the feed zoomed in on their equipment. Those are chemical propellant weapons. And are those bladed tools on their belts? They look like museum pieces, another officer said. This is what Earth sends to fight the Vrex? But Admiral Kuvan watched the way the humans moved, the way they checked their equipment, the way their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. There was something in their bearing, something she couldn't quite name. It was the look of people who had walked into fire before and expected to do it again. The forgotten warriors had returned to the galaxy, and nothing would ever be the same.